During the Cold War, satellite imagery revealed a massive hidden rail yard deep in Soviet territory, fenced off, heavily guarded, and officially non-existent. Thousands of locomotives sat rusting in rows, and no one outside the military knew why. A single black-and-white satellite image, snapped over the Siberian steppe in July 1964, set off a quiet alarm inside the National Photographic Interpretation Center. The photo showed a fenced rectangle, lined with parallel tracks, and dotted with rows of identical locomotive silhouettes, far more than any normal depot would hold. There were no signs of civilian traffic, no bustling workers, just a silent grid of engines sealed away from the world. The official Soviet rail maps showed nothing at these coordinates. Analysts pored over the details. One, John L. Cox, drafted a memo labeling the site a possible strategic rail reserve. He flagged the unusual blackout curtains drawn across outbuildings and the absence of any freight cars. Other specialists argued it could be a seasonal repair yard or even a decoy built to mislead Western eyes. The debate stretched on through the winter, as new satellite passes revealed similar complexes in the Altai foothills and the Kazakh steppe. Each site showed the same pattern: hundreds of engines arranged in perfect rows behind double fences and guarded perimeters. Requests for ground confirmation were denied. The Soviet Ministry of Railways issued terse statements, dismissing Western speculation as fantasy. One official communique from 1972 insisted that all locomotive depots in the Union are accounted for and subject to civilian oversight. No mention was ever made of hidden reserves. Soviet press releases described ongoing modernization, never acknowledging a secret stockpile. Inside the intelligence community, uncertainty grew. Some analysts recalled the trauma of World War II, when the Red Army's survival depended on restoring shattered rail lines in days. Others pointed to the vast scale of the Soviet rail network, 145,000 kilometers, crossing 11 time zones, moving 80% of the military's heavy cargo. A few worried that the West was missing a new kind of threat, a hidden fleet ready to roll out after a nuclear strike. Then, in 1972, a defector from the Ministry of Railways arrived in the West. His account was measured, almost clinical. He described isolated depots, special maintenance crews, and a strict protocol. He said no information about the reserve may be shared beyond authorized personnel, and that violation is punishable under Article 64. He confirmed that the stockpile was not an accident, but a deliberate reserve ordered by the Politburo and kept secret even from most Soviet officials. Yet even his testimony left doubts. Some defectors described the yards as junk piles, others as pristine emergency fleets. The truth remained shrouded behind layers of denial and incomplete evidence. For Western intelligence, one fact became clear: the Soviet Union had built something vast and hidden, and the official story did not add up. The puzzle of the locomotive graveyard was not just about trains, it was about the logic of a system that prepared for disaster in secret, while insisting to the world and its own people that nothing was amiss. A train could travel from Brest to Vladivostok, over 9,000 kilometers, without leaving Soviet rails. The network stretched across 11 time zones, binding the country's vastness into a single logistical artery. Nearly 80% of all military equipment, fuel, and food moved by rail. Factories in the Urals and Siberia depended on these lines to keep steel, oil, and grain flowing in both directions. Railways were not just infrastructure, they were the state's lifeline. World War II exposed the system's vulnerability. In the first months of the German invasion, nearly a fifth of the Western rail network was destroyed. Bridges fell, engines were sabotaged, entire yards burned. The Red Army's ability to move reserves, evacuate factories, and supply the front depended on restoring tracks and engines almost overnight. Survival hinged on rail power. The lesson was brutal and clear. Without trains, the Soviet state itself could collapse. In July 1959, the Politburo issued a decree that changed the fate of thousands of locomotives. Drafted with the Ministry of Railways and the Ministry of Defense, the order reclassified specific engines as strategic military assets. From that point, these locomotives were treated like missile launchers, subject to secrecy protocols, their locations and maintenance records classified. The decree established a strategic reserve, locomotives kept in working order, hidden in remote depots, ready for immediate mobilization if war erupted. The logic was spelled out in the decree itself. A future war, especially one involving nuclear weapons, would devastate main lines and rolling stock. Only a dispersed, protected fleet could guarantee the restoration of rail traffic after an attack. Senior rail planners, many scarred by the chaos of 1941 and 1942, argued for the reserve with the urgency of experience. They remembered recovery efforts that had relied on spare engines and parts hidden far from the front. The new reserve would institutionalize that wartime lesson, ensuring that no single strike could paralyze the nation's logistics. Soviet war games in the early 1960s, including Operation Zarya, modeled scenarios where NATO attacks severed every main artery in Europe. The answer was redundancy. Engines stockpiled in Siberia and Central Asia, beyond the reach of Western bombers, kept ready for rapid reactivation. By the early 1970s, satellite images and defector accounts revealed hundreds of locomotives stored at sites like Tomsk, Karaganda, and the Altai foothills. Each depot was guarded, blackout curtains drawn, maintenance crews working under strict secrecy. The Ministry of Railways devoted nearly 1% of its annual budget to the reserve, diverting steel, copper, and labor from civilian upgrades. Regional officials grumbled about the cost, but central planners insisted on readiness. Over time, the reserve grew far beyond any plausible need, yet secrecy remained absolute. Engines that could have modernized the network sat idle, locked away as insurance against a disaster that never arrived. Inside the perimeter fences, the so-called graveyards followed a regimen that left little to chance. Each locomotive was cleaned to bare metal, then layered with a thick, oil-based coating, an industrial varnish mixed with rust inhibitors, developed by Soviet metallurgists and specified in Ministry of Railways technical orders. Silica gel packs, marked with replacement dates, were stuffed into fireboxes and bearing housings to absorb moisture. Canvas tarps, heavy enough to withstand Siberian winters, were strapped over the cabs and boilers. The process wasn't improvised. It followed a strict manual, updated every few years, that governed every step from draining coolant to sealing windows against dust. The reserve yards ran on a silent schedule. 3-person teams of engineers rotated through each site, working 2-week shifts. Their names logged in classified ledgers. Their tasks were repetitive but essential. Check for leaks, reapply the oil coating if it cracked in the cold, replace silica packs, and test the handbrakes. Maintenance was logged in notebooks coded Z5, the same code found in internal Ministry of Transport inventories. Each locomotive carried an activation kit, spare pistons, new gaskets, and a set of tools, all sealed in waxed paper. Once a month, the crews would crank engines by hand or roll them a few meters along the rails to keep bearings from freezing in place. Every action was recorded, countersigned, and filed away in a locked cabinet inside the depot office. These were not scrap heaps. The yards were designed for rapid reactivation. Boilers were left with a thin film of mineral oil, ready to be flushed and fired within hours. Diesel tanks were drained but kept sealed to prevent condensation. Even the batteries, stored in heated cabinets, were rotated and charged on a strict timetable. Engineers followed a checklist that looked more like a military readiness roster than a civilian maintenance log. The scale of human effort was matched by the resources poured into preservation. Each yard consumed tons of lubricants and desiccants every year. Replacement tarps and sealing compounds arrived in unmarked crates, delivered by rail from factories in Bryansk and Kolomna. The Ministry of Railways budgeted for these supplies under innocuous line items, masking the true purpose from all but a handful of senior officials. Local supervisors knew only that their crews were forbidden to discuss the work, even with family. Violations brought disciplinary hearings or, in rare cases, criminal charges under secrecy statutes. For Western analysts, these procedures were the clearest evidence that the graveyards were anything but accidental. The combination of technical precision, regular maintenance, and strict secrecy pointed to a deliberate reserve, not a dumping ground. The real puzzle was not why the engines were hidden, but why so much effort went into keeping them ready for a disaster that never came. Across the vastness of Siberia and Central Asia, the reserve system sprawled in a pattern only visible from above. 3 main clusters, one near the Altai foothills, another in the Kazakh steppe, and a third along the Trans-Baikal Rail, anchored a network of at least 9 major depots. Each site covered several square kilometers, their boundaries marked by double fences and ringed with guard towers. Satellite analysts traced the outlines: concrete sheds, parallel tracks, and the unmistakable grid of engines parked in formation. At the Altai Reserve Yard, for example, overhead imagery from the early 1990s revealed more than 100 steam locomotives lined up beneath heavy roofing, their silhouettes unchanged for years. The numbers themselves defied easy comprehension. Early Western estimates based on satellite counts and factory production ledgers ranged from a few hundred to over 10,000 engines in storage at any given time. Soviet records, where they could be accessed, were even more ambiguous, with serial numbers assigned to reserve-grade locomotives but no public inventory of where these machines actually rested. Post-Soviet surveys, sifting through abandoned ledgers and on-site counts, suggested a total reserve stock of roughly 800 to 1,200 locomotives by the late 1980s. But some Russian railway historians, drawing on Ministry of Railways technical orders and closed procurement lists, argued the true figure could have reached several thousand during the height of the Cold War. The lack of transparency was not accidental. Each depot was coded in internal documents under innocuous-sounding project names, with the Z5 designation masking entire budgets from regional oversight. The scale was measured not just in engines, but in resources siphoned from the rest of the economy. Maintaining these hidden fleets required vast quantities of steel. Estimates suggest up to 2 million tons were diverted from civilian rail upgrades and construction projects. Annual ruble allocations for the reserve consumed nearly 1% of the Ministry of Railways budget, a figure that drew complaints from regional officials struggling to fund local infrastructure. Yet, in the central accounts, these sums were duplicated, with steel and labor earmarked for civilian production quietly redirected to the reserve, then logged again under strategic contingency. The result was a shadow economy of double-counted quotas and hidden expenditures, all justified in the name of wartime readiness. Bureaucratic inertia fed the system's expansion. As new war games envisioned ever more catastrophic scenarios, nuclear strikes severing every main line and chemical attacks contaminating entire regions, the logic of redundancy hardened. No official dared propose shrinking the reserve. Instead, each 5-year plan added more engines, more supplies, and more layers of secrecy. Internal memos show that even as electrification and dieselization swept the main network, planners ordered new batches of steam and diesel locomotives built to reserve specification, with reinforced frames and simplified controls for rapid reactivation. The reserve became self-perpetuating, its budget lines and personnel roles locked in place by the very secrecy that had once justified its creation. the economic drain was not lost on those tasked with balancing the books. In regional planning meetings, officials quietly questioned why so much steel and labor vanished into remote depots, while factories went without spare parts and city dwellers queued for basic goods. But the logic of the system, its commitment to worst-case survival, overrode such concerns. The graveyard was not an accident or a byproduct of decay, but a deliberate institutionalized insurance policy. Its true cost was measured not only in rubles and metal, but in the opportunity lost for a civilian economy always running short. In the spring of 1992, a team of Russian journalists stepped through a sagging gate on the outskirts of Kyakhta. For decades, the yard had been a blank spot on maps and a forbidden zone for locals. Now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the locks were broken, and the guards had disappeared. What the reporters found stunned even the most skeptical editors. Endless ranks of locomotives, their bodies streaked with oil and rust, stretched into the fog. Some engines still wore Ministry of Railways inventory tags, their numbers faded but legible. Others were sealed in tarpaulin cocoons, untouched since the 1970s. The scene was captured in a photo series published by Nezavisimaya Gazeta on June 14, 1992, triggering a wave of public disbelief and official confusion. Ownership of the yard was immediately disputed. The new Russian Ministry of Transport claimed state inheritance, while local officials argued the land belonged to the regional government. Lawsuits piled up in Buryatia's courts as journalists pressed for access, and former depot workers came forward with stories of secret maintenance shifts and locked record rooms. Agency spokespeople, now untethered from Soviet-era scripts, struggled to explain why so many engines had been hidden away. Some insisted the reserve was a relic of Cold War logic, an insurance policy against disaster. Others hinted at bureaucratic overreach, pointing to the duplicate budgets and missing steel shipments that had quietly fueled the reserve for decades. The photographs landed like a thunderclap. For the first time, the public could see what had been denied for a generation. Not a graveyard of scrap, but a meticulously preserved fleet, waiting in silence for a war that never came. The shock rippled outward, raising uncomfortable questions about secrecy, waste, and the true cost of a system built on preparing for catastrophe in absolute silence. Inside the Ministry of Transport's archives, entire yards disappeared behind the code Z5. This was not just a label, but a firewall. Any mention of Z5 in ledgers or maintenance logs signaled material that could not be tracked by regional auditors or ordinary planners. The code appeared not only in locomotive records, but across a spectrum of Soviet reserves, hidden tanks, secret grain vaults, even water caches near Moscow, each with its own Z5 appendix, each insulated from outside scrutiny. This method of concealment became a template. By the late 1970s, parallel reserves multiplied. Diesel locomotives joined steam engines in the graveyards, and new depots appeared in the shadow of existing ones, all coded under innocuous project names. The same logic justified hidden stores of armored vehicles and food. Bureaucrats learned to shield entire budgets behind Z5, creating a shadow economy in which quotas were double-counted and steel allocations vanished into the system's blind spots. Wherever secrecy thickened, opportunity followed. After 1991, as the locks fell away, anti-corruption investigators found that scrap profiteers had already moved in. Court files from the mid-1990s describe bribes of 250,000 rubles per 100 tons of locomotive steel, with total kickbacks running into the millions. Some regional officials pocketed entire trainloads of metal, selling off the reserve for quick cash while pretending to oversee lawful decommissioning. The same files document how inventories were falsified, with reserve engines quietly removed from Z5 ledgers before being stripped and hauled away. The physical aftermath lingered in the soil. Environmental scientists measuring diesel residue at former storage sites found polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in concentrations 2 to 3 times above Russian safety limits. Fuel tanks left to decay leaked into groundwater, and the heavy oil coatings, once a symbol of readiness, became a source of persistent pollution. The graveyard's secrecy had protected its engines from war, but left its land scarred by the invisible costs of hidden paranoia. Today, the rusting engines stand as silent witnesses, not to Soviet might, but to a fear so deep it demanded secrecy from its own people. As governments worldwide still hide waste and worst-case stockpiles behind classified fences, the real question endures. When does preparation become paranoia, and who pays the price for secrets built on fear? Let me know what you think in the comments below.